like someone asked, they were like, "How's your mom?" And he's like, "She's doing good." And I'm like, and then I thought of like his mom is really.
But I created an NGO.
Like that's
for those two things.
Yeah.
Is she still alive?
We care 24.
Her husband, though, she watched her husband.
If you want to participate, right.
There's so many. There's so many.
Please do so.
I'm pretty sure that Caroline
Burned out.
Caroline's son, I think.
They do a very
JFK.
yes, it's a website. We care 2030. I'm looking for that. So I started getting a petition to us.
Everyone just like in Massachusetts knows their business all the time.
Individuals and corporations.
No, I just mean like their personal lives. It's
Not
just
only
like
corporate.
they're
And
our celebrities.
actually accepted it in the Talanoa dialogue that was held this
Oh,
year.
Wow, look at
You know, class bonding.
Epa, mi hermano. Bueno, quiero hablar contigo, ¿eh? Que conversé ayer con
I know I can move my bag.
Camilo.
Definitely make room for all my candles. Like, she was meant to come and speak to me. Order a few
Acuerdo de paz sobre cómo implementar el Acuerdo de Ginebra, que es
Oh, yeah,
dentro
we have to
del
go
marco
check
de
in
la
with
guerra
him.
fuera
When I
de
do that.
Pues yo tengo una tesis doctoral de eso.
Mándame la página y quiero invitar a almorzar con mi güey.
Dale, dale, escríbeme.
Gracias, pa.
I know. Oh, no, you're okay.
Does that then
Geneva Conventions in a non-war situation.
also when you
So anyway,
Crazy
so you say this
the same thing.
You're already sitting in front of the mic.
You're enough to ask questions.
So what did you listen to his end with the vaccination thing?
He's totally right. This is totally true.
So Luke and I are like,
This is totally true. At
Because
the
like,
UN, they were
I-
investigating the same thing.
What is the way to say it is not that, and I don't think he did, is that you should vaccinate kids, and that's not what he's saying. But he's saying that the processes that they, like, you got to get vaccinated.
was the Speaker of the House from
I'm actually not listening.
from 1971 to
You have to be.
1977,
Well,
his grandfather, and I had no idea how powerful that was.
because I don't believe it. I actually think they're injecting
I'm like,
you.
at first I was like, oh,
And because I know you get these things.
no, like the U.S.
When?
That's just like one of the
And antibiotics.
something you would experience.
There is antibiotics.
But the alternatives terrible.
I know. The research that is like the base of the vaccine scare is actually been shown to be
Totally. I
don't know where to go.
I'll find out. Let me find out for you guys. You want to see me?
No. I
Just like here's something good, just write down what it is. And then
Get the thing. Maybe I'll get the sign up.
I'm just gonna hop up to the benches up there. Yeah. I just need to sign it.
yeah, we don't really
That's great.
it just seems like a lot of correlation.
Totally.
This
But
happens
like,
after 20 years.
what do you think the argument is for them being exempt from regulation of being laws against that?
That was really interesting.
What are they trying to?
Yeah, that is weird.
What are they trying to achieve with that exemption?
Because they're trying to like make sure that they're
I have like
I mean, then carve that out in the exemption. But there should be rules so that it's a rigorous process and that the people's health is being prioritised.
Yeah,
That's consistent. Absolutely.
Yeah.
You want the same process in place for that.
We have a meeting after. I feel like I'll talk to Kelly.
It's very, very
Your job more just like help that.
like look at every single
Yeah, like I want to ask her if there's like obscure drugs and why they haven't been doing that, or if it just slipped through the cracks. Because if it just slipped through the cracks, it doesn't come up much. You're able to hear that and use. But vaccines are so heavily studied before and finished.
You think so, but
Yeah.
I don't know, like as a mom, happens when there is a measles outbreak and you're the mum that didn't vaccinate your kids, and what do you do?
That's a
then?
huge reason.
So that's why I'd like to know that the law is there so that they
Really?
the process they go through.
Eastern Colorado, but the numbers are so high. It was a issue when I worked in
Environmental issues and then environmental connections don't air pollution
protests
is
out
much
of
stronger evidence than like vaccines. So it's like you know the information. And so for me, I like went back afterwards and I was like, my PhD is based on experience. So it is based on
Your PhD is based on this issue.
yeah, it was good. She's really it was a nice foundation. But the thing is, it's literally like the methodology of thinking through the science. What about in like how much, when, where, how, right? Did you something that makes like there's any luck?
No, I think they're not putting makeup to the thing.
Oh, is Wentworth facility?
No, please, you want to see here?
No.
Sure. I will catch it. He'd say credit. When you say credit, I saw him over there.
It's not a common name. Is he? Do you think their birthday was?
yeah, he is. Did you not get this?
Like a money making.
They handed them out.
I've got
I've
a
been
sniff of
It's okay. Like conspiracy. Like, do they get anything out of it?
like is he like they take him mad? Those
for action.
class action lawyers take him massive. And yeah, like 40%
He helped me at credits.
they're huge cuts, but I don't know. Like
No,
I'm sure the Kennedy family are struggled down financially. I don't know.
No, it's super. I don't know. It's a little sad because I definitely felt my not excitement.
Yeah, we're saying happy birthday to
No, like respect. Like idealism has a dial.
I know. I was like, I'm so with you, and now I still want to be with you. But that's weird.
Oh, you had?
And stuff, so I was like ready for it, and just I mean, we only Saturday 5 to 6, and it's good.
Are you? You should be. What's this?
from Australia.
What do you do?
It came out. We are working. We have several groups. We have a political action branch and an education branch. The education branch is like some different awareness projects. I mean, the orientation program and the sports work. And then the political action branch. Most of working on the divest harvest.
I used to work with
so much about
this person.
Okay, I see.
yeah.
Sorry, Saturday 5 to 6.
Yes, but then in the Lotel 10.
In the low time.
6. And like, yeah, and it's like, I'm grounded.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah, of course. His second
I'll come by. Just tell me where you see it.
This on the beach.
is 6.
It's the best service.
No, not even. I'm leaving in 5 minutes.
This is way more gossip.
What are you trying to get him to do? Take my chance off.
Thank you.
Jumping in there.
I don't think it's that extreme. What are you trying to get him to do? She wants me to expose myself to the speaker.
Once we get him here,
I might ask this guy.
Good evening, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. My name is Luke Albert, and I'm a first year studying government at the college, as well as I'm a member of the JFK Jr. Forum Committee here at the Institute of Politics. Before we begin, please note the exit doors, which are located on both the park side and JFK Street side of the forum. In the event of an emergency, walk to the exit closest to you and congregate in the JFK Park. Please also take a moment now to silence your cell phones. You can join the conversation tonight online by tweeting with the hashtag JFK Junior Forum Live, which is also listed in your program. You can also follow us on Instagram at JFK Junior Forum. Please take your seats and join me in welcoming Robert Kennedy Jr., Randolph Wentworth, and Director of the Institute of Politics, Mark D. Guerin.
Well, thank you, Luke. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and again, welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. I am just here for a brief welcome to our distinguished guests. We are very fortunate. One of the issues that comes up time and time again from our students is the question of environmental sustainability, preservation of our natural resources. So into that very important topic, we're particularly grateful for Bobby Kennedy coming back to Harvard to share his perspective with us. He's had a very busy day with the fellows here at the Kennedy School. And so to formally introduce him, let me bring forth Rand Wentworth, but join me in welcoming back to Harvard, an environmental activist and someone whose commitment to the public good bears our respect, Bobby Kennedy. Welcome. Thanks, Rand.
All right. Thank you, Mark. So I first met Bobby Kennedy 25 years ago when we were both in Atlanta, Georgia, working for building public support for the preservation of the Chattahoochee River, which runs right through Newt Gingrich's district and provides the drinking water for metropolitan Atlanta. Now, we thought the best way to do that would be to get visiting dignitaries and the media out on rafts and actually see the river. It was a hot May day, we were all in shorts and t-shirts, and Bobby went off on the lead raft. I hung back with the dignitaries and Secretary of the Interior, Bruce Babbitt, and the media. Now, after about a half hour going down through Whitewater, Bobby's raft turned a sharp curve in the river, and he went out of sight. And we're paddling along. Well, unbeknownst to us, Bobby had beached his raft, climbed up a 30-foot cliff, and waited patiently for the strategic moment. When the dignitary raft came around the bend, he jumped off the cliff, cannonball, drenched everybody, to great laugh. And Bobby Kennedy has been sending cannonballs to those in power ever since. He's one of the extraordinary environmental leaders of our time. For the past 30 years, he has been the senior attorney for NRDC. He's been the lead attorney for the Hudson River Keeper, and he's been on the faculty of Pace University Law School, where he really invented the idea of the Environmental Law Clinic, bringing second and third year law students to work to do the research to bring corporate polluters to task. You know a big name polluter, Bobby has sued them. Exxon, Consolidated Edison, Monsanto, DuPont, the list goes on. I'm particularly proud that his work includes working with the NAACP, environmental justice issues, and he's represented native tribes, indigenous people all over the world, working to protect the sacred waters of their sacred lands. He now turns his attention in his own private law firm for suing the big and the powerful, to bringing them to task for polluting people's health and well-being. And most recently, he's won an extraordinary settlement against Monsanto for their lies about the toxicity of the pesticide Roundup, and won a $290 million settlement for a single individual. This is an extraordinary accomplishment. He's used the power of the courts and the power of law to get our nation's rivers clean. It wasn't but a few decades ago that the river a block from here was known as the Big Dirty. And thanks to the Clean Water Act and a lot of strong enforcement, it's now a river you can swim in. This is an extraordinary thing. So we welcome Bobby back to his alma mater. I especially want to thank many people, including Patrick Lynch and Kat Townsend, where's Kat, and the CPIC, and especially the IOP for making this event possible tonight. Please join me in welcoming Bobby Kennedy.
Thanks, man.
And I don't remember that incident, but it could have happened. Anyway, I'm very, very happy to be here. I want to start by just apologizing for my voice. I had a very strong voice till I was 42 years old, and then I got a disease called spasmodic dystonia. It makes my voice shaky like this. The good news is that usually after a couple minutes, either you get used to it or it gets better when I'm speaking. I'm really honored to be here. This is like coming home to family, kind of is family. I was particularly happy to spend the day with Rand, who's the Louis Bacon Fellowship, who runs the Louis Bacon Fellowship here. And Louis Bacon is one of the biggest funders of Waterkeeper. Louis Bacon is a Wall Street currency trader who has spent huge amounts of his fortune preserving land and funding environmental movement. He's a lifelong Republican, but he understands the connection between the environment and democracy and the economy. And one of the things that I learned very early on in my career, I started working for commercial fishermen who were capitalists, was that we're not protecting the environment so much for the sake of the fishes and the birds. We're protecting it for our own sake, because we recognize that nature is the infrastructure of our communities, that if we want to meet our obligation as a generation, as a civilization, as a nation, which is to create communities for our children that provide them with the same opportunities for dignity and enrichment and prosperity and good health as the communities that our parents gave us, we've got to start by protecting our environmental infrastructure, the air we breathe, the water we drink, the wildlife, the fisheries, the public lands, those resources that cannot, but by their nature, cannot be reduced to private property ownership, because they're part of the community, what we call the commons, or the commonwealth, or the public trust. The rivers, like the Charles, are the landscapes that connect us to our past, to our history, that provide context to our communities, and that are the source, ultimately, of our values and our virtues and our character as a people. I started my environmental career on the Hudson River, which was the birthplace of the Waterkeeper movement. It was started by a small group of commercial and recreational fishermen who mobilized on the Hudson to take the river back from the polluters. We have on the Hudson River the oldest commercial fishery in North America. It's 350 years old. Many of the people who I represented for 35 years on the Hudson came from families that have been fishing the river since Dutch colonial times. It's a traditional gear fishery. They use the same fishing methods that were taught by the Algonquin Indians to the original Dutch settlers of New Amsterdam and then passed down through the generations. One of the enclaves of the commercial fishery on the Hudson is a little village called Crotonville, New York. That's 30 miles north of New York City on the east bank of the river. And the people who lived in Crotonville in 1966 were not your prototypical affluent environmentalists. They were factory workers, carpenters, lathers, electricians. Half the people in Crotonville made their living, or some part of it, fishing or crabbing the Hudson. These were people who had little expectation that they'd ever see Yosemite or Yellowstone or the Everglades. For them, the environment was the Hudson River. It was their backyard. It was the bathing beaches, their swimming holes, their fishing holes, their food supply, their property values, their livelihoods. Richie Garrett, who was the first president of the Riverkeeper, used to say about the Hudson, it's our Riviera, it's our Monte Carlo. Richie Garrett was a grave digger from Austin, New York. He used to tell his new followers, I'll be the last to let you down. But in 1966, Penn Central Railroad began vomiting oil from a 4.5-foot pipe in the Croton Harmon rail yard. And the oil went up the tides, and it blackened the beaches, and it made the shad taste of diesel, so that they couldn't be sold at the Fulton Fish Market in New York City. And all of the people in Crotonville came together in the only public building in the town, which was the American Legion Hall. This was a very patriotic community. Crotonville had one of the highest mortality rates during World War II of any community in the United States. Virtually the entire male population joined the Marines the day after Pearl Harbor. Almost all of the original founders, board members, and officers of Riverkeeper were former Marines. They were combat veterans from World War II and Korea. These weren't radicals, they weren't militants, they were people whose patriotism was rooted in the bedrock of our country. But that night they started talking about violence because they saw something that they thought they owned, which was the abundance of these fisheries that their parents had exploited for generations, and the purity of the Hudson's waters, and it was being robbed from them by large corporate entities over whom they had no control. And they'd been to the government agencies that are supposed to protect Americans from pollution, the Corps of Engineers, the Conservation Department, the Coast Guard, and they were given the bum's rush. The Corps of Engineers colonel in Manhattan, after 20 separate visits by Richie Garrett, who was a former Marine, Korean War vet, and another Marine named Art Glauca, begging him to do his job and shut down the Penn Central Pipe, he finally told them in exasperation, "These are important people. Speaking of the Penn Central Board of Directors, we can't treat them that way. In other words, we can't compel them to obey the law." By this evening in March of 1966, virtually everybody in Crotonville had come to the conclusion that government was in cahoots with the polluters. The only way that they were going to reclaim the river for themselves is if they confronted the polluters directly. And somebody suggested that they put a match to the oil slick coming out of the Penn Central Pipe and burn up the pipe. Somebody else said they should roll a mattress up and jam it up the pipe and flood the rail yard with its own waste. Somebody else suggested that they float a raft of dynamite into the intake of the Indian Point power plant, which at that time was killing 1 million fish a day on its intake screens and taking food off their family tables. And then a guy stood up whose name was Bob Boyle, and he was the outdoor editor of Sports Illustrated. He was a combat veteran from Korea. He was one of the most famous recreational fishermen in this country. He had written 6 books on angling. He created a renaissance in dry fly tying in this country. 2 years before, he had written an article about angling in the Hudson for Sports Illustrated. And in researching that article, he had come across an ancient navigational statute called the 1888 Rivers and Harbors Act. And that statute said that it was illegal to pollute any waterway in the United States. You had to pay a big penalty if you got caught, but also there was a bounty provision that said that anybody who turned in the polluter got to keep half the fine. And he sent a copy of that law over to the libel lawyers at Time Magazine, which owns Sports Illustrated, and he said, "Is this still good law?" They sent him a memo back saying, "In 80 years, it's never been enforced. It's still on the books, and it's good law." So that evening, when all these men and women, 300 people in the American Legion Hall, were talking about violence, he stood up in front of them with a copy of the law and the memo from the attorneys, and he said, "We shouldn't be talking about breaking the law. We should be talking about enforcing it." And they resolved that evening that they were going to start a group that was then called the Hudson River Fishermen's Association. It later became Riverkeeper, and they were going to go out and track down and prosecute every polluter on the Hudson. 18 months later, they collected the first bounty in United States history under this 19th century statute. They shut down the Penn Central Pipe for good. They got to keep $2,000, which was a huge amount of money in Crotonville, New York in 1968. There were 2 weeks of wild celebration in the town, and they used the money that was left over to go after Ciba Geigy, Tuck Tape, Standard Brands, American Cyanamid, the biggest corporations in America, in 1973, and winning all those cases. In 1973, they collected the highest penalty in United States history against a corporate polluter. They got $200,000 from Anaconda Wire and Cable for dumping toxics at Hastings, New York. They used that money to construct a boat that today patrols the Hudson, tracking down polluters. In 1983, they hired their first full-time riverkeeper, a former commercial fisherman named John Croton. He hired me using bounty money a year later in 1984 as their attorney. And since that time, over the next 30 years, we sued over 500 polluters on the Hudson. We forced polluters to spend over $5.5 billion remediating the river. And today, largely as a result of our work, the Hudson River, which in 1966 was a national joke, it caught fire, it turned different colors depending on what color they were painting the trucks at the GM plant in Tarrytown. It was dead for 20-mile stretches, zero dissolved oxygen, north of New York City, south of Albany. Today, it's the richest waterway in the North Atlantic. It's an international model for ecosystem protection. It produces more pounds of fish per acre, more biomass per gallon than any other waterway in the Atlantic Ocean north of the equator, and it's the last major river system left in the North Atlantic. And I'll throw in the Mediterranean and the Aegean and the Adriatic and the Baltic and the Black Sea and the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus and all the rivers that flow into them. There's only one left that still has strong spawning stocks of all of its historical species of migratory fish, and that's the Hudson. It's Noah's Ark. It's a species warehouse. It's the last refuge for many of these animals that are going extinct elsewhere. And the miraculous resurrection of the Hudson has inspired the creation now. Almost immediately, we started getting calls mainly from fishing groups around the country and then from surfing groups on the West Coast, and then from everybody saying, we want to start a riverkeeper and do what you're doing. So we started an organization 20 years ago this year, which was the Waterkeeper Alliance, which is the umbrella group that coordinates, licensed the groups we own, the Waterkeeper, Riverkeeper, Soundkeeper, Baykeeper, Lakekeeper, and all the family of names. We license these groups to get started. Each one has to have a patrol boat. They have to be willing to sue polluters. They have to have a full-time paid waterkeeper and be an advocate for one defined water body. We now have 345 waterkeepers in 44 countries. We have Patrick Lynch here, who for many years was the Futalefu riverkeeper in Chile, one of, I think, 40 riverkeepers in Latin America. And we're the fastest growing and largest water protection group in the world. So one of the things that I'm going to tell you a couple of things that I learned from my involvement with these groups and with my involvement with the litigation for all these years, is that one of the things that bound all the waterkeepers together is the idea that we own the waterways and that it's a democratic right and that it's the essence of democracy. The waterways and the fisheries are not only part of the commons, of the Commonwealth, they are also a social safety net. During the Great Depression, 20,000 men went down to the Hudson and found sustenance, and 10,000 went down and found jobs. They could catch fish and crabs and sell them, and people had lost their jobs. You couldn't do that today, because we no longer own the fish in the Hudson. They're owned by the General Electric Company, because they privatized them all with their PCB pollution. So they're dangerous now for their, it doesn't hurt the fish, because a striped bass has 6,000 babies. But it hurts people who, it's an endocrine disruptor and a carcinogen, and we're not legally allowed to sell those fish anymore. And the fishermen understood that the Constitution of the state of New York and the Constitution of the state of Massachusetts, as the people of the state own the waterways of the state, and they own the fisheries of the state. They're not owned by the General Electric Company, they're not owned by the utilities, they're not owned by the governor or the fisheries department. Owned by the people. Everybody has a right, everybody in Boston or Somerville has a right to go down to the Charles River, throw in a plug and pull out a catfish and bring it home and feed it to their family with the security they're not poisoning somebody. But that right has been stolen from the people of this state. It's an act of theft. And this is ancient law, by the way. This law goes back, it's called natural law, the deists like John Adams and Thomas Jefferson said that it was self-evident, this kind of law, that the people own the public trust. They own, that's why Massachusetts is a commonwealth. And the law goes back, it's called the public trust doctrine, to ancient Rome. The Code of Justinian, which was the first attempt at constitutional government, said that if you were a citizen of Rome, you had an absolute right to the public trust assets, those shared assets, air, water, wildlife, fisheries. They even had aquifers and public lands. They had something that was kind of an equivalent to a public park or forest. If you were a citizen of Rome, you had an absolute right to cross a beach, throw in a net, and pull out your share of the fish. The emperor himself couldn't stop you. When Roman law began to break down, any time that constitutional government or democracy begins to devolve into tyranny, one of the first acts, the features of tyranny, are actions by powerful private entities within a society to privatize the public trust. And you can do that by taking land or by polluting the air, stealing the air from people's lungs or polluting the fish. And when Roman law began to break down during the Dark Ages, during that 800-year time of famine and ignorance and tyranny and oppression and darkness, in virtually every jurisdiction in Europe, private lords and feudal lords and feudal kings began reasserting control over the commons. For example, in England, King John said private people and peasants can no longer hunt game animals. They now belong to the nobility, the rabbits and the deer. This was a social safety net for that class. If your crop didn't come in, if your family was hungry, you could always go into the forest and bring out a deer or a rabbit and feed it to your family. Now he said you can't do that anymore. Those belong to the nobility. That's what got him in trouble with Robin Hood. He also erected navigational tolls on the Thames and the other rivers of England so that what was once free, which was to take goods and services up and down the river or to go up to visit people, now you had to pay for the privilege. He also sold monopolies on the fisheries of England to powerful private lords and other interests. So that, again, a social safety net, you could net a fish and feed your family, now you had to pay for the privilege. This caused the barons, the public led by the barons, to rise up, and they confronted King John at the Battle of Runnymede, and they forced him to sign the Magna Carta. The full name of the Magna Carta is Magna Carta and Charter of the Forest. And the Magna Carta, this is where virtually all of our rights from the Bill of Rights, the Bethlehem, that document was the Magna Carta, including rights that we don't have anymore, like habeas corpus. But it also it included among those rights was free access to fisheries, navigable waters, and public parts of the forest. And those rights, when we had the revolution in this country, those rights descended to the people of the states through the state constitutions. So in 1847, the law in every jurisdiction in the United States was that if you had a factory and smoke or pollution from your factory got into the local river or onto your neighbor's land as little as 1 day a year, you had an absolute right to shut down that factory. There was no right to pollute. It was a trespass. It was an assault on private property rights of other members of your community. Those laws after 1847, through corruption and through because of the power and the attraction of the Industrial Revolution, were eroded and subverted. So polluters were essentially given open season, and this everybody considered it a good thing for a long time. And then Rachel Carson came along in 1961 and said, guess what? We've all been in the chemical industry, which we all thought was a savior, is contaminating all of us and killing all of the animals, the wild animals and the birds. And then people started looking around and saying, I remember what it was like before Earth Day. I remember the Cuyahoga River burning for a week with flames that were 8 stories high and nobody being able to put it out. I remember Lake Erie being declared dead. There were tens of thousands of Americans who died in smog events every year. The eastern Adams peregrine, the most spectacular predatory bird in North America, went extinct in 1963, the same year that my uncle died from DDT poisoning. And in 1970, though, that accumulation of insults drove 20 million Americans out onto the street, the largest public demonstration in American history, demanding that our political leadership return to the American people those ancient environmental rights that had been stolen from our citizens over the previous 80 years. The political system responded because of this massive public outpouring. Republicans and Democrats were terrified. And Nixon created EPA, kicking and screaming. He signed the Clean Water Act, signed the Clean Air Act. Over the next 10 years, we passed 28 major environmental statutes. The CERCLA, RCRA, Safe Drinking Water Act, and all the others. And those were all, and those, I've spent, each one of those contains a citizen supervision. It says when the government fails to enforce this law, citizens can step into the shoes of the United States Attorney and sue the polluter for penalties and injunctive relief and get their attorney's fees at the end of the case. And I spent 30 years of my career enforcing those laws through the citizen supervision. And so that's sort of one issue, that we own these things and that they belong to the people. Everybody has a right to use them. The commons, nobody can use them in a way that will diminish or injure their use and enjoyment by others. And that's the law. The other thing that I learned from the fishermen was that good economic policy and environmental policy are the same. And you hear a lot of times it's kind of become a mantra of the big polluters, the Koch brothers and others, and their indentured servants in Washington and their toadies on Fox News. And we have to choose between economic prosperity on the one hand and environmental protection on the other. And that's a false choice. In 100% of the situations, good environmental policy is identical to good economic policy. If we want to measure our economy, and this is how we ought to be measuring it, based upon how it produces jobs and the dignity of jobs over the generation, over the long term, and how it preserves the value of the assets of our community. If, on the other hand, we want to do what the Koch brothers and the other big factory farm industry and the chemical industry want us to do, which is to treat the planet as if it were a business in liquidation, convert our natural resources to cash as quickly as possible, have a few years of pollution-based prosperity, we can generate an instantaneous cash flow and the illusion of a prosperous economy. But our children are going to pay for our joyride, and they're going to pay for it with denuded landscapes and poor health and huge cleanup costs that are going to amplify over time and that they will never be able to pay. Environmental injury is deficit spending. It's a way of loading the cause of our generation's prosperity onto the backs of our children. And one of the things that I've done during my now 35 years as an advocate is to constantly go around and confront this argument that an investment in our environment is a diminishment of our nation's wealth. It doesn't diminish our wealth. It's an investment in infrastructure. The same as investing in telecommunications or road construction. It's an investment we have to make if we're going to ensure the economic vitality of our generation and many other generations. And when I was in Rand's class today, we were talking about about markets and free market capitalism. And what I said, at that point is that I really think free markets are the answer to most of our environmental problems. And there's a lot of hostility among the environmental community towards markets. To me, markets are not good or bad. It's a tool. It's like a hammer. You can build anything you want, or you can destroy anything you want. If free market capitalism is the most powerful economic engine ever devised by human beings, but it has to be harnessed to a social purpose. Otherwise, it's going to pull us straight down a predictable path of plutocracy, of oligarchy, and of environmental annihilation. That's what it's going to do. It's going to commoditize all of us, turn everything into money. Markets work when there are rules and when there's enforcement. And you know, in a good marketplace, the marketplace would be rationalized, to rationalize our energy consumption, rationalize in a way that punishes bad behavior and rewards good behavior. So punishes pollution and rewards efficiency. In a true free market economy would promote efficiency, and efficiency means the elimination of waste, and pollution is waste. In a true free market would require us to properly value our natural resources, and it's the undervaluation of those resources that cause us to use them wastefully. In a true free market, you can't make yourself rich without making your neighbors rich and without enriching your community. What polluters do is they make themselves rich by making everybody else poor. They raise standards of living for themselves by lowering quality of life for everybody else, and they do that by escaping the discipline of the free market. You show me a polluter, I'll show you a subsidy. I'll show you a fat cat using political clout to escape the discipline of the free market and force the public to pay their costs of production. You look, you know, the Koch brothers say we love the free markets. And, you know, all these seductive noises come out of their mouths. If you look at the groups they're funding, like the Cato Institute and the Heritage Institute, it's all about giving subsidies to oil companies and to factory farms and to the worst, most destructive kind of activities, and to the war machine. It's all about subsidies. Oh, and what, you know, all of the, in a true free market, if you want to bring your product to market, you pay for all the costs of getting it there. And that includes the cost of cleaning up your mess, which was a lesson we were all supposed to have learned in kindergarten. And all of the federal environmental laws that were passed after Earth Day 1970 are all intended to restore free market capitalism in this society by forcing actors to pay the accurate costs of bringing their products to market. And what we do in the Waterkeeper movement is we don't even consider ourselves environmentalists. We're free marketeers. We go out into the marketplace to assure the integrity of free market capitalism. We go out and we track down the cheaters, the polluters, and we say to them, we are going to force you to internalize your costs the same way that you internalize your profits. Because as long as anybody is cheating the marketplace, none of us gets the advantages of the efficiency, the prosperity, and the democracy that should be the legacy of free market capitalism. And what we have to understand in this country is there's a huge difference between true free market capitalism, which we don't have in America, and corporate crony capitalism that we do have, which is as antithetical to efficiency, prosperity, and democracy in America as it is in Nigeria. And, you know, if you look at, you know, these great figures who came out of Boston, and Virginia, Madison, and Jefferson, and Adams, one of the big warnings that they made to future generations was about the domination of corporate power. And, you know, we know that the two big threats to democracy are government power and corporate power. And but people focused on the power of government, mainly people who don't want to pay their taxes. For probably the last 20 years, that's been their focus. And big government is a threat to democracy. When the government is reading our emails and, you know, kicking down doors and keeping secrets from the American people, those are all threats to democracy. But the biggest threat comes from corporate power, and our most visionary political leadership throughout American history have continually sent us that warning. Teddy Roosevelt, who was a Republican, said that American democracy would never be destroyed by a foreign enemy. But he warned that it would be subverted and eroded and leveled by malefactors of great wealth who would steal it from within. Dwight Eisenhower, a Republican in his most famous speech ever warned Americans against the domination by the military-industrial complex, which he said was going to destroy democracy and turn America into a plutocracy. And Abraham Lincoln, definitely the greatest Republican and probably the greatest president that we ever had, who was the founder of the Republican Party, is said to have said in 1863, during the heart of the heat of the Civil War, "I have the South in front of me and the bankers behind me. And for my nation, I fear the bankers more." And Franklin Roosevelt said during World War II that the domination of government by corporate power is, quote, "the essence of fascism." And Benito Mussolini, who had an insider's view of that dynamic, complained that fascism should not be called fascism. It should be called corporatism, because, as he said, it was the merger of state and corporate power. And what we have to understand as Americans is there's this big difference between free market capitalism and corporate capitalism. Communism is the domination of business by government. Fascism is the domination of government by business. And our job is to walk that narrow trail in between free market capitalism and democracy, and keep big government at bay with our left hand and big business at bay with our right. And if we want to do that, we have to have an informed public that's able to recognize all the milestones of tyranny. And we need a independent press that's willing to speak truth to power. And we need political leaders who will go beyond doing the easy thing, which is to use all these alchemies of demagoguery, and instead to do something that's going to benefit future generations and that is going to force this country to live up to its highest ideals. So I'm really happy to be here. To me, all of these issues are intertwined: the democracy, the economy, and the environment. And ultimately, they all boil down to a moral issue. Is what kind of society are we going to create? Are we going to create a sustainable society that is able to leave a legacy of dignity and democracy to our children? Or are we, is America just a place where everybody comes to make their pile bigger and bigger, and whoever dies with the most stuff wins? And, I think virtually everybody in this room shares my idealism and determination about what kind of country we want this to be. And that's one that my uncle and my father lived and died for, which is a nation of idealism that is exemplary, not because it can beat people up, but because it is an example of the finest values of government and humanity. Thank you all very much.
And right on time. Would you like to? What a symphonic exploration of conservation, democracy, and true fair American capitalism. As is the custom here at the forum, we have 4 mics, and we invite students first and then others to stand at one of these mics, and you ask the questions, and then Bobby Kennedy will offer some thoughts on that. We have just a couple things for you to think about as you shape your question. First, please state your name and your affiliation. Second, keep it brief. A good question is under 15 seconds. And third, end your question with a question mark. All right. All right. So I'm looking at the mics. Erica, are you standing there? It's a good opportunity. All right. We'll also, if we have a good ping pong game going here. We'll have short questions and short answers, and we'll hear from a lot of students through that. So, Bobby, you can sit or stand as your pleasure. Please, introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Lisa, and I am a joint degree student here at the Kennedy School, not the business school. A couple of us from the joint degree program this past weekend went to West Virginia to learn about the coal industry, energy transition, as well as economic transition. First of all, thank you so much for everything that you shared today. It resonates a lot with, I'm sure, all environmentalists here. And the question I have is, well, this is getting a little long, but in West Virginia, it became very clear that taxation and shifting away from certain environmentally damaging activities does mean a loss of livelihood for certain populations. And I was wondering if you could speak to economic transition and how we can pursue a more environmentally friendly future while caring for the people who are impacted in their most fundamental livelihoods by these changes. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many answers to that question, and I've got to figure out how to do this and be brief. But in every transition that we've had in history, people get economically injured, and there's people, particularly who are the poorest, oftentimes usually shoulder the disproportionate burden. They also shoulder the disproportionate burden of pollution. West Virginia, coal has not been a good friend to West Virginia. It's left behind a legacy of polluted waters. It's probably the most, in terms of drinking water, there's virtually no state, no waterway in southern West Virginia that is uncontaminated with really horrible stuff. It is destroyed the landscapes. And, the coal mining that we've seen, particularly over the past 2 decades, has increasingly eliminated human beings from the equation. Mountaintop removal mining, it used to be that you had, when my father was running for office, he talked to me a lot about West Virginia. Our family had a deep interest in West Virginia. If West Virginia made my uncle president, during the primary, my family spent a very, very long time there. Both parents disappeared for 6 weeks during the election to West Virginia, and they always credited West Virginia with making my uncle president. They were determined to do something about the poverty in the state. My father, at the time, they called it strip mining, and I remember my father talking to me about it. And at that time, there were 156,000 unionized mine workers in West Virginia. And he said they're not just destroying the environment, they're doing it to destroy the unions. Because it was a form of mining that eliminated human beings, and it was very capital intensive and not labor intensive. Well, today, there's about 9,000 miners in West Virginia left, and virtually none of them are unionized. When you go to those little hollows and the little villages, you'll see the union halls boarded up. So they were being squeezed and squeezed and squeezed by this industry, and the pollution was increasing. And of course, and I remember when miners telling me this, who were out of work in West Virginia while there was a mountaintop mine right behind them, saying they won't hire miners from West Virginia. They advertise using airplanes and television ads and newspapers in Myrtle Beach, North Carolina, because they don't like people who come from a union culture. They want non-unionized people, and they were bringing them from out of the state to do the mining, and then they'd put 6 or 8 people, cut down a whole mountain range with these giant machines, and then move on to the next ridge. There's only a couple of ridges left in the entire southern West Virginia that are untouched by mountaintop removal. And now they're saying it's the environmentalists who are at fault for destroying the livelihood. They did it a long time ago, and it had nothing to do with the environment.
Yes, yes. Moving to our next mic, Isaias from Venezuela. Introduce yourself.
Thank you so much. And first of all, thank you for sharing with us. My question is probably in the mind of a lot of students, but how would you activate the activist? And how can we spread your idealism worldwide?
I wish somebody would tell me that, but I'm you know what, we do, Waterkeeper is a grassroots group. We have 344 grassroots leaders in every community, so I've seen the things that work. And if you want to do organizing, you should have a campaign. And that can be litigation or something like that. But that really, to me, in my experience, is what works. Litigation for me, we're a law enforcement organization. We do, that's what we do. That's what our wheelhouse is. We find polluters who are breaking the law, people who are injured by those polluters, and we try to go into those communities and find justice and then find healing. And in suing a polluter, and particularly when you win, you get a lot of followers. That's one of the, so litigation is not just a point in its own, but it's also an organizing tool in those communities. Your question is a hard one because what we do to rally people around an idealistic cause is often the most difficult thing. What Donald Trump is doing is easy. You know, when my father was killed in 1968, he was running, people don't remember this, but George Wallace was also running in that election. And when we took my father's body from Union Station in New York to Washington, D.C., there were 2 million people lining that rail track. And I remember I was 14 years old, and I remember the faces. It was a cross-section of America. There were black people, white people, Hispanics, there was rabbis, there was nuns, and priests, people, holding signs, holding their babies up, holding signs that said, goodbye, Bobby, pray for us, Bobby, American flags. But it was a complete cross-section of all of the kinds of crowds that I had seen since I was a little boy. All the different campaigns. And 4 years after he died, I was at this institution as an undergraduate. And in 1972, and I was studying political science in a course, and I remember seeing polling data that year that showed that the vast majority of white people who had lined that rail track, who had supported my father strongly in 1968, in 1972, instead of supporting George McGovern, who was aligned with my father in every way, they supported George Wallace, who was antithetical to everything my father believed in. And it struck me then, and it's occurred to me many times since, that every nation, like every individual, has a darker side and a lighter side. The easiest thing for politicians to do is to appeal to our anger and our hatred and our bigotry and our smallness and our selfishness and make us feel isolated and besieged and under attack. And that my father tried to do something different, and he was successful because he got those people. And that was to get people to share a vision of idealism, to transcend their narrow self-interest, to step away and take a risk of joining hands with other people in their community and feeling like they were part of it. My father was able to see heroes in everybody. And to feel that they were part of some kind of heroic journey. And those are that is the task of an idealistic politician and a progressive politician, to make us all feel like we're part of a community and that it's okay, we can take the risk to act together. The things that Donald Trump does is the easiest thing for a politician to do. It is formulaic. These are the alchemies of demagoguery. You use code words and dog whistle codes to make people understand that, I am a friend of the racist. And, Donald Trump can say that he's not racist, but all the racists are supporting Donald Trump. And they're doing that for a reason, because he's telling them, guess what, I'm with you guys.
All right, please.
Hi, my name is Kara. I'm a junior in the college. And I'm also from a few miles away from the Hudson River. And you mentioned the Indian Point power plant, which, if people don't know, is a nuclear power plant. And you talked about how it was killing thousands of fish. And that brought to mind a question about how do we balance the needs of the climate long term with regards to carbon emissions and conservation, because often we may find conflicts between things like hydroelectric power and the way that that might impact waterways. So how do you balance the needs to limit our carbon emissions with the needs to protect our environment?
I mean, the easiest way to do that, in my view, is through free markets. Is you force everybody to internalize all of their costs, and then you choose the cheapest way to go. Today, to build a solar plant costs about $1 billion a gigawatt, and a wind plant costs about $1.2 billion a gigawatt. A coal plant costs $5 billion a gigawatt. A high efficiency gas turbine gas plant costs about from $3 to $6 billion a gigawatt. The last nuclear plant built on this planet cost $9 billion a gigawatt. So, I mean, you can make energy by burning prime rib if you want. But I would say we should take the cheaper way to do it. And the cheapest way to make energy today is wind and solar. And it's by far the cheapest. There's not even any content. And, you know, I don't believe anybody will ever build a nuclear power plant like that again. I don't think anybody's going to build a coal plant because the liabilities are so high. But I've said for many years, people said, are you for nuclear? Are you against nuclear? I say, no, I'm for nuclear as soon as they make it safe and effective, or safe and efficient. Efficient means it's cost competitive, and it's just not. It's the most, you know, hideously expensive way to boil a pot of water that's ever been devised by the human mind. It also is not safe. And it's not me saying that. It's the insurance industry in this country. The guys, you know, from the big insurance companies, they won't insure it. So the industry had to go out in the middle of the night in a sleazy legislative maneuver and get the Price-Anderson Act passed, which says that if they have a nuclear explosion and your house gets irradiated, they don't have to pay you. Oh, they don't have to pay insurance. And I say to them, the nuclear power industry, if you're safe, and get an insurance policy, and everybody will believe you. Until you get an insurance policy, nobody's going to believe you're safe. Oh, nuclear is a joke because, and no, there's no utility in the world that would build a nuclear power plant unless the government paid for virtually the entire thing. And that's how it happens. They never pay for them themselves.
All right, Brittany.
Hi there, my name is Brittany Janis. I'm a mid-career MPA at the Kennedy School. Your story of the founding of the Waterkeepers Alliance kind of reminds me of the fact that environmentalism never used to be a partisan issue. And certainly people like ranchers and farmers and fishermen can be really fantastic environmental advocates because they're so close to the land that they see the challenges and the problems that come from pollution. But that demographic has largely been captured in some ways by a party that is against regulation, largely because of the corporate interests that back it. So in some ways, this is similar to the question Isaiah asked, but specifically for the people who work close to the land, who traditionally were environmentalists and did care about what happened to the land. How do we amplify those voices? How do we get them back on the side of the environmental advocacy movement? And what are the different ways that we can reactivate that population?
It's a really good question, and I would say that's what I've spent my career trying to do. I've been working with fishermen. I've represented and worked for the Farmers Union, which is the antithesis to the Farm Bureau, which is the group you're talking about, which is owned by industry, Monsanto, and Smithfield, which is now a Chinese company, which own the Farm Bureau. It's right-wing, anti-environmental group. But that's not all there is out there. If there's recreational and commercial fishing interests. have been very, very strong allies of the environmental movement, particularly the smaller fishing companies. And there's ranchers and farmers all over the country that are our allies. We represent farmers all over North Carolina, Iowa, and the other states in lawsuits against factory farms. So they're out there. I mean, I could explain to you some of the economics. Some of it is cultural. You know, the people who live in rural areas they're only getting. I drove across Alabama a couple of weeks ago. There was no NPR station. You know, all there was right-wing radio, and the right-wing radio was not just AM radio. It was all over the FM. It would dominate the FM dial too, so there was no voices, alternative voices in the rural areas of this country that anybody's hearing. And, you know, that has an impact on people. If you watch Fox News for long enough, it actually makes you stupid, and that's proven. So,
all right, we have time, I think, for 2 more questions. And would you like to start?
I'm Matthew Shaw. I'm a junior at the college. I just want to thank you for the work you've done in taking on Monsanto and getting them to acknowledge the toxicity of glyphosate and the fact that it's contaminated the food supply of really everyone in the world at this point. My question is, given the enormous win that you had in that case, why was it so poorly covered by the media, particularly in this country?
You know what, there's a lot of issues that I work on that are not covered by the media that really make me disturbed. But I thought Monsanto was pretty well covered. I thought it got, even like the Wall Street Journal, I mean, they didn't like it, but they covered it. So people know about that case. And this is a, $289 million case. Well, I'm with a group of lawyers. We have altogether now about 15,000 cases representing individuals who got non-Hodgkin's lymphoma after being exposed to Monsanto's weed killer Roundup. And that's one issue. The Roundup is a very bad product that causes a lot of harm, and it's not, it's celiac disease and allergies and non-alcoholic fatty liver cancer and kidney cancers and breast cancers and many, many, many other diseases. The one that kind of passed the scientific threshold where we could actually bring a lawsuit, there's a very strict threshold called the Daubert standard, which has analogies in state court, where you can't just bring any claim of science to court. It has to have enough sufficient peer review. And the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma claim passed that threshold 2 years ago, so that we are actually allowed to make that argument to a jury. And since then, we've assembled about 15,000 cases, and we tried the first one, which was a man who was a school superintendent in California who was forced to spray Roundup, and he got very, very bad non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And we won a $289 million verdict from the jury. So, and this is a scary thing for Monsanto. Bayer, which had just purchased Monsanto, its stock price dropped about 14% and has not regained. It's continued dropping since then. Tonight I go back to San Francisco to try the second case. And this one's in federal court, and then we have case after case after case for the next years until hopefully they'll settle at some point. But I think it got a lot of coverage in the financial news because they couldn't ignore it because the stock was dropping. So people did cover it, but you're right. In many cases, they don't cover when there's big shots, when there's oil companies or other companies, out there, particularly pharmaceutical companies, because pharma owns the press. They put $5.4 billion into advertising. This is the only only 2 countries in the world that allow direct sales of pharmaceutical drugs to the public. Because everybody in the world, including the AMA, believes that it corrupts medicine and corrupts the press. New Zealand and here. And so, you know, those are, you're not even allowed to talk about. When we sue pharmaceutical companies, nothing goes in the press. If you look at a typical news show has 20 to 24 advertisements on it, the evening news. 17 of those are pharma on average. So they are not only purchasing advertising, they're purchasing content. They're dictating what Anderson Cooper, I mean, if you look at Aaron Burnett, Anderson Cooper now, they're just unashamed. They say brought to you by Pfizer. Oh, you know, and those companies have paid $35 billion. They're all convicted felons. They paid $35 billion since 2009 for lying, for bribing people, for fraudulent science, corrupting legislatures, poisoning, killing hundreds of thousands of people, and nobody will touch them.
Here at the forum, we wrap up at 1 hour, so this is time for the last question. For those of you who are in line, I'm sure Bobby would be willing to visit with you after the program, but the last question goes to you.
Hi, my name is Fatah Aden. I'm a junior at the college. I study environmental science and engineering, but I hope to go to grad school for public policy. And I wanted to ask you a question about navigating the realms of science, economics, and politics, and then conveying it to the public and making sure that all 3 aspects of those different kind of realms are just like kind of understood and gets the point across that you wanted to show to the public.
Fatah, what are you? It sounded like a huge question. Just summarize it for me again.
Yeah. So how do you enter the world of science, economics, and politics, and then go to the public and mesh all 3 of those worlds together and help them understand the science, the money, and then the laws that need to be put in place to solve this big issue regarding the environment?
Well, that's what, you know, advocacy is. Those are the puzzles that we're always trying to figure out. How do you, you know, get a message across to the public? And that's the challenge. That's what, you know, Martin Luther King said the tools of advocacy were agitation, legislation, litigation, and innovation. And we have to use all of those things to get our message across. And oftentimes, you know, and like we were just talking about, there's a limit that the mainstream media will cover on these issues. They'd much rather, and particularly nowadays, that, you know, we have a circus going on Capitol Hill, and all of this palace intrigue that's going on with Mueller and Cohen and, you know, and Roger Stone. Meanwhile, Trump has proposed regulations that is going to remove Clean Water Act protection for virtually every river and stream in the arid West, every lake in our country, 27 million acres of wetlands, 2 million miles of rivers. Every river that doesn't cross a state line will lose protection. And there's almost 100% chance that that regulation will be promulgated and will become law, and then we have to sue, and we end up not on a very soft landing in the Supreme Court, where you have, you know, now Kavanaugh, whose mother 30 years ago tried to do the same thing and was, you know, thrown out of the EPA for that. Her, you know, Rita Lavelle and all of her deputies were sent to jail because they were trying to gut our environmental laws, including the Clean Water Act. I don't know what Brett Kavanaugh is going to do with that, or not Brett Kavanaugh, but Gorsuch, whose mother was the EPA director, and you know, and we have a Supreme Court that is more anti-environmental than any in our history, and we have a White House that's the worst in our history. And nobody's covering it because they're all involved in the circus in Washington, and it's almost like purposeful. That all of this, you know, glitter and crazy stuff is going on, and nobody's paying attention to what's really happening to our country. So, thank you, Fatah.
So I take that as a call to action for everyone in this room to be inspired by the life work of Bobby Kennedy, by his courage and tenacity and his determination to win case after case and bring justice to polluters. And to your call to action tonight, I give thanks, and let's put our hands together for Bobby Kennedy. Well done.